This conference will now be recorded.
There we go. Okay, for many watchers of Channel 79, this is the Town of Darien Sewer Commission. We are holding a special meeting on July 29th, 2020, primarily to hear from our consultants, Arcadis, who are doing a thorough study of of our sewer system, starting with the Stony Brook sewer shed. And that'll be the purpose of today's meeting, technical in nature. I think that's it. Ed, do I have to cover anything else?
No, I think you got it covered.
All right, well, with that, I'll hand it over to Arcadis to take us through their good work.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you to the Commission for convening this special meeting to give us an opportunity to provide you with an update on where we stand on the town's II program. So just a refresher on the Arcadis team. We have 4 team members on the call today. Myself, Vanessa McPherson, who is serving as the project manager for the program. We have our technical director, Scott Haynes, our project engineer, Lindsay McCarthy, and our II and GIS specialist, Amy Anderson. And I think you'll hear from pretty much all of us today. So with that, I'll walk us through an agenda for today's meeting. We'll start with a quick health and safety moment. I'll give a refresher on the scope for the project. And then Lindsay will walk us through an overview on flow monitoring with the basics and concepts. And Amy will walk through the data analysis that's been done for the infiltration and inflow results that we got from the metering program that was recently done. And we'll wrap it up with next steps. But I do want to say that we'd love for this to be a dynamic discussion. So if at any point during the slides there's a question or a need for a clarification on any concept that we're presenting, please don't hesitate to just unmute and pause us so that we can cover it while we're on the slide, and there's no need to wait until the end. We welcome the interruptions as we go through. So our health and safety moment today is about our summer friend, the menacing mosquito. They are out and about. If anyone's had a late evening summer barbecue, you've seen them. And they're not just a pain. They can also be dangerous, right? They transmit diseases, which are shown here on the slide. I won't go over them all, but really the ultimate goal is risk prevention, right? Eliminating standing water, using bug repellents, protecting your exposed skin, and just avoiding those times of day when they're out in full force. So here's a refresher on the project scope. If you take out your magnifying glass, you can probably see the town map where we have the different sewer sheds that are tributary to Stony Brook, as Craig mentioned, that are part of this study. And Lindsay will and Amy will go into a lot more detail on those sub areas. But really the project scope is a focused infiltration and inflow program. And the sub bullets, which are the tasks in that program, are updates to the town's GIS system as it pertains to the sewers, a flow metering and II analysis program, which is bold because that's really the focus topic of today's discussion, and that's in progress. We also have a sewer system evaluation survey known as SSES. Those are investigations that will come out of the flow monitoring and II analysis piece. And we'll talk about that a lot more today. We have pump station evaluations that will be conducted, and then the recommendations that will come out of the SSES activities. And the last part of the program, overall program, is our assistance in the development of a capacity management operation and maintenance, lovingly known as CMOM, document that we're working with the town to prepare. So with that, I will give the mic here to Lindsay to walk us over the basics in flow monitoring.
Great, thanks, Vanessa. So before we really dive into the data, the infiltration and inflow analysis data, we wanted to go over some specific terms that we'll be using throughout the discussion, and also provide a general overview of the components and objectives of a flow monitoring program. So there's two main types of extraneous flow that can enter a sanitary sewer system, and this is infiltration and inflow. What's commonly referred to as infiltration is specifically groundwater infiltration. And this is groundwater that enters the system through defects in the main lines, the laterals, and the manholes. And as the groundwater levels rise, and if there's defects in the infrastructure, then this is an avenue for the groundwater to enter the system. So this is infiltration entering the system from the bottom up. Inflow is stormwater that enters the system through either direct or delayed sources. Direct inflow is exactly as it sounds. It's stormwater that enters the system during a storm event through direct connections. This can be catch basins, roof leaders, holes in manhole covers. When direct inflow enters the system, it's a relatively immediate response and an increase in the sewer flow. Delayed inflow, on the other hand, enters the system after time delay and after the storm has ended. So when you hear delayed inflow, probably what most people may think of is sump pumps, but there's actually an additional component to that. It's rainfall derived infiltration. And this is stormwater that percolates or seeps into the ground and then into the sanitary sewer through what we talked about before, the defects in the main lines, the manholes, and the laterals. So this is a top-down infiltration, and it can take time to get into the system. So overall, the main purpose of a flow monitoring program is to collect information on the flow characteristics of each sub-area in response to groundwater and rain events, in order to really quantify the groundwater infiltration during the high groundwater periods and inflow during wet weather periods in each of those sub-areas. And to collect this information, flow meters are installed in a downstream manhole of the sub-area, and the flow is being continuously metered before that flow exits that sub-area and goes into the next sub-area. The rainfall and the groundwater is monitored utilizing rainfall and groundwater gauges, and these are installed as part of the project, or you can utilize existing ones that may already be in the town. In this case, for this project, we installed groundwater gauges and rainfall gauges, and these are actually pictures of the ones that are installed in your town, and also a picture of a flow meter. And again, this is one that was installed in one of the sub areas. The biggest takeaway, kind of the point that we want to drive home, is that flow monitoring is a tool, and it's utilized to prioritize these sub areas with the purpose of really tailoring the follow-on SSES investigations based upon whether a sub area is experiencing high infiltration, high inflow, or both. And so the flow monitoring is really the first step in understanding the types of extraneous flow that's entering the system and into each sub area. But the follow-on investigations are really what's utilized to pinpoint and identify those sources. So we get the big picture through flow monitoring. Follow-on investigations really kind of hones it in on what's causing the extraneous flow to get into the system. So once the data is collected, the infiltration analysis and inflow analysis can be performed. Groundwater infiltration analysis, it's performed by evaluating and looking at the average nighttime flow on a dry weather day, and that's between the hours of 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. because this really represents the period of time with the lowest water usage and sanitary flow within the system. Therefore, the majority of flow in that system during that time period can be attributed to groundwater infiltration. And the rule of thumb is that, if there's no significant nighttime industrial users or other users, that 85 to 90% of the average dry weather nighttime flow during this period is considered groundwater infiltration. The inflow analysis is performed by looking at the flow patterns during wet weather events. Typically, we like to look at multiple storms, and we select a few to evaluate to see how the system responds under different storm conditions. The figure here kind of presents the picture of how we evaluate and look at developing the calculation for the inflow. So here in this portion, this is as I mentioned before, there's the direct inflow and the delayed inflow. So this portion here is the direct inflow, and it is the difference between the wet weather flow, which is this line here, and our dry weather flow, and it's during the storm event. So the difference here is what is our direct inflow. On the other hand, the delayed inflow, it's still the difference between the wet weather flow and the dry weather flow, but it's it's after the storm has ended, and it's until that wet weather flow normalizes and reaches the same, level as the dry weather conditions. So for Darien's flow monitoring program, it was an 8-week metering program, and it was during the high groundwater period. This ran from March 30th to May 24th, 2020. Flow meters were installed in each of the 9 sub-areas that we were evaluating. And as I mentioned before, these flow meters were installed in the downstream portion of the sub-area to capture the flows prior to exiting that sub-area. So in order to monitor the rainfall and the groundwater, 2 rain gauges and 2 groundwater gauges were installed in different areas of the town. And this was to provide a holistic view of the storm events and groundwater depth and fluctuations between the 2 portions of town. So in the northeast portion of town, there was a rain gauge installed on the roof of the Royal Elementary School. And the groundwater gauge was on Buttonwood Lane. And then in the southeast portion of town, there's a groundwater gauge on Hecker Avenue, right in front of the police station. And the groundwater gauge is, I apologize for that. I just mixed that up. And the rain gauge is on the roof of Town Hall. All right, so at that point, I'm going to hand it off to Amy to discuss the infiltration and inflow analysis data. We're going to be presenting one of the storms that we evaluated just to provide an overall picture of our findings. And this was a storm that occurred on April 13th, and it was approximately 16 hours. The total rainfall was about 1.84 inches, and the peak hourly intensity was 0.24 inches per hour. So that, I'll hand it over to Amy.
I'm sorry, Lindsay, would you mind going back to the previous slide? Just one thing I want to point out.
Yes.
That may not. The graphic on the left there, the Buttonwood Lane and the Hecker Ave groundwater gauges. On that graphic, the top of that graph is 0. That's ground level. And then, as you can see, the groundwater level at each of the gauges fluctuates throughout the course of the year. And then the flow monitoring period, when we had the flow meters running, is highlighted in blue. So that's when we were a relatively high groundwater period compared to the drier months, the lower groundwater months. And that's what you want. You want high groundwater, so there's the better potential for the groundwater to be getting into the pipes, and you can identify where that is taking place. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott and Lindsay. What I'm going to do now is walk through each one of the 9 individual sub areas, point out some key characteristics that we noticed when we looked at the data, and sort of explain one hydrograph for one storm for each sub area. So as Lindsay mentioned, I'm going to touch on the inflow analysis first, simply because we did some additional infiltration investigations, and I want to talk about that on the next slide. So Lindsay talked about that April 13th storm. So this is a hydrograph right here. I'm moving my mouse and I'm realizing you can't see that, only Lindsay can.
Here it is.
The red line on that graph is your base flow. The teal line, that bright green, is your wet weather flow. And the light green line, the one at the bottom, actually is your infiltration and inflow. So you can see for this storm event, you definitely had a significant response. We had about 74,000 gallons of direct inflow that occurred when it rained, and 432,000 gallons of delayed inflow. So what that tells me in this situation is you definitely have something going on that's a direct connection. So that could be a roof leader, a catch basin connected, but you also certainly have some of that RDII, that rainfall induced infiltration that's happening after it rains. So the ground becomes saturated and all the cracks in your pipes or cracks in your manholes, the infiltration just starts seeping into your pipes and shows up as this delayed inflow. Another thing on this graph, on this slide that we can talk about is your actual everyday general flow analysis. We have for all of our sub areas the average daily flow, the peak daily flow, and the peak hourly flow. And right next to that, for comparison purposes, we did our groundwater infiltration analysis, which Lindsay said earlier was we take that midnight to 6 a.m. flow where we shouldn't have any, there really shouldn't be that much actual usage, and we take 85 to 90% of that number, and we call that your average infiltration rate. We then convert that number on a gallons per day per inch diameter mile to come up with a rate. That 2000 number, that's truly the number that a lot of DEEP and Mass DEP and other regulators use as sort of a threshold number. And it just sort of means, let me see if I can explain this. So you have your gallons per day, your infiltration rate, but depending on the size of your pipe and the length of your pipe, you're not always comparing apples to apples. So by coming up with this gallons per day per inch mile, it's a way to standardize it. If that makes sense.
Quick question on the numbers. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
The general flow, is that segregated, domestic sanitary, or does that have the groundwater in it?
So that is your actual metered flow. So that's everything.
Okay.
That's
everything. Okay.
Yep.
So the infiltration would be a portion of that, and
That's
the inflow
correct.
would be a portion of that. Got it.
Yep.
Yeah, yellow plus red equals green.
Yes.
Correct, Amy?
That's right.
And the blue at the top, that represents your rainfall events. There's a lot of axes here, but the precipitation axis is on the right, and those are inches of rain over the course of time on the bottom axis.
Lindsay, you can go to the next slide. So in addition to doing flow metering in Mansfield Ave Upper, we use this springtime to do some flow isolation. And what flow isolation does is it's a nighttime SSES activity where you use manual weirs and you get a flow. So it's sort of like how we did that infiltration calculations where we were looking for the nighttime flow. This is people man access entry into these manholes and physically taking a weir and coming up with a flow calculation. Now we do this in high infiltration areas to isolate, to find out which pipe segments actually have the infiltration and which ones don't. So it's another tool that we use to sort of narrow down and pinpoint where the problem areas are. We wanted to get a jump start on some of these SSES activities. So we went right ahead and did this Mansfield Ave area. And it was actually very interesting to see because even though we only had about 2,000 gallons per day per inch diameter mile for our average infiltration rate, we were able to identify some pretty big players. And those are noted here in the red. Now there's another red shading color put on here. So what we do is after we look at the flow isolation results and see what those numbers are, we make recommendations for CCTV. So this just sort of shows you how we hit a meter downstream, and that was a tool to help us determine we needed to do flow isolation. And from there, we were able to hone it down even more and come up with just these select segments for CCTV recommendations. So the flow isolation determined that we had about 83,000 gallons per day of groundwater infiltration just from those exact weir measurements that were taken. Next slide, Lindsay. So this is Mechanic Street sewer shed, and we did the same thing here. We also did some flow isolation, so I'll go over that after this slide. Here we notice we definitely, as Scott pointed out again, the blue is rainfall, and red plus green equals blue, or red plus yellow equals blue. We had about 32,000 gallons of direct inflow for that April 13th storm and 160,000 gallons of delayed inflow for that storm. So here you'll actually notice if you look on the graph, that tail where the blue line is higher than the red line, that actually goes on for quite a long time. Now that could be a variety of things. It could be that rainfall induced infiltration we talked about, could be people using sump pumps. There's a lot of different things. Could be, leaky manholes. So that's definitely an example of a spot where we would want to do further investigation. Our average daily flow here, which is a combination of, it's just the direct flow from the meter, was about 166,000 gallons per day, with a peak of 216,000 gallons per day, and then a peak hourly flow of 283,000 gallons per day. Now our infiltration rate here was a little lower, 71,000 gallons per day, and 1,700 gallons per day per inch diameter mile. So you'll notice that compared to the Brookside sewer shed we just talked about, this one's a little lower. But if you go to the next slide, Lindsay, we did some flow isolation here as well to help really narrow down where we're going to do the CCTV. And we did find about 60,000 gallons per day of infiltration, but we were really able to isolate where our problem areas were, which is the whole goal. Linz, do you want to click on the, yeah, there you go. We noticed right what's shaded here in that red and that pink shading were, it's almost like the worst things we've found so far. You had really leaky pipe joints. They were able to see them when they did the investigations. So again, using this process, we're able to say, okay, in Mechanic Street, we already know the segments we want to CCTV, and we don't have to do investigations in the entire sewer shed anymore.
Are we concerned about the areas where we could not access pipes? Are we doing anything to remediate that?
We are. So what we're doing, it's a case by case. So if we couldn't access, but we know upstream and downstream did have issues, we're including them in further investigation work. So we'll keep an eye on those other pipes, whether it be manhole inspections or something moving forward, or just, you know, taking a look to see what's going on. We don't want to ignore them completely. And like I said, the ones where we know what's going on in that general area, we're including them for further investigation. So this is Leroy Ave Upper, smaller sewer shed. This one also, it had about 110,000 average daily flow, 150,000 gallons per day peak daily flow, and 177,000 gallons in peak hourly flow. Now you'll notice these numbers are not that different, but if you look at their infiltration rate, they have about 52,000 gallons per day of infiltration and a 2,800 gallons per day per inch diameter mile. So that's the highest one we've seen yet. And then for inflow, for that storm, you had about 100,000 gallons of direct inflow, 175,000 gallons of delayed inflow. So you certainly have a rainfall response here. And again, like before, when it rained, you saw your flows peak, and they really did stay elevated for several days. So we would definitely be making recommendations for further investigation here.
And Amy, this is a good place to point out that the upper right, this is how why it's important to normalize the data. For a smaller sewer shed, you expect to get lower total gallons per day, but when you normalize it over the size and the length of feet or miles of sewer in an area, it's a greater flow rate per inch of pipe, or I'm sorry, mile of pipe, and inch of diameter of pipe than some of the bigger areas.
So Mansfield Ave Lower. So something I want to point out here right away before we even start talking about this is that there are 3 sub-areas tributary to this. So when you're doing these calculations, we have to subtract out. So right now we've got Mechanic Street, Leroy Ave Upper, and Mansfield Ave Upper that flow into this sub-area. So when we start doing subtraction, sometimes you have to take into account that the timing might be off a little bit. So it is something that we pay attention to. So these numbers here are shown as net numbers. Oftentimes, if we see a peak or a number that doesn't look quite right, we investigate it, you know, we really hone in on the details, because when you start doing that subtraction, things can get a little off. So our average daily flow here was about 83,000 gallons per day, with a peak daily flow of 185,000 gallons per day, a peak hourly flow of 200,000 gallons per day, an infiltration rate of about 46,000 gallons per day, and 2,000-ish gallons per day per inch diameter mile. So again, some infiltration on the higher end-ish end of what we've seen. Now, when we went and did an inflow analysis here, For direct inflow, we saw almost nothing. So when it was raining, we didn't see that immediate peak. That could be for a lot of reasons. One, it could be that we have direct inflow upstream, and by the time it reached the Mansfield Ave Lower meter, it was already delayed. So these are things that we're really looking into. Does that make sense to everybody when I say that? That if something more upstream was a direct connection, by the time it hit our meter at the end of the Mansfield Ave Lower tributary area, it would be a time delay. So we see almost all of our inflow here as delayed inflow. So this sewer shed, West Ave Lower, there's nothing tributary to this one. And this is a prime, this graph is as clear as day that there is a problem when it's raining. You do have, even though it shows a large delayed inflow number here, about 105,000 gallons, it's clear it really ramps up, your inflow really starts to ramp up when it's raining. So combined, you have about 140,000 gallons of inflow for that one storm in this area. Average daily flow numbers, 181,000 gallons per day. Peak daily flow, 254,000 gallons per day. And you actually had a peak hourly flow over the course of your period of 376,000 gallons per day. So there's a difference there. So you definitely have water is getting into your system when it rains. Infiltration rate, on the other hand, of 71,000 and a 1,343 gallons per day per inch diameter mile, which is on the lower end of what we've seen. So it's very interesting, even though you might see a high number compared to the other sewer sheds, it might not be a priority. This one's West Ave Middle sewer shed. So this one flows directly to Stony Brook. Again, we have a gigantic wet weather response here to this rain event. On average daily flow is low, 85,000 gallons per day. It's a smaller sewer shed. Peak daily flow, 133,000, and peak hourly flow, 206,000. Infiltration rates on the lower side, 28,000 gallons per day, and only about 1,000 gallons per day per inch diameter mile for that infiltration analysis. However, when you look down at the inflow graph, we definitely have a huge peak here that trails out for a little bit. So it's definitely worth, looking into finding out what's going on here, because I definitely would say there's either some direct connections or you really have that high rainfall induced infiltration. I did notice overall in going through this analysis that the sewer sheds that we looked at don't really have that great of a groundwater infiltration response, but they certainly do have a wet weather response.
And Amy, correct me if I'm wrong on that last graph. Go back, Lindsay. On that rain events, and similar to the last study area, the yellow, or the very bottom lime green, exceeded the domestic flow in red.
It did, yep.
So the flow going through your sewer system was more rainwater, if you will, than actual sewage connections.
That's correct. At that time, yep. Stony Brook. Stony Brook is interesting when you go to analyze it, because almost all of the sewer sheds that we analyzed flow through Stony Brook. So when you go to do your net calculations, there's a lot going on here. Stony Brook is a sewer shed where we already know it has things that we want to investigate, and it's very obvious, clear, as seen by the hydrograph, that there's a wet weather response with a huge delayed inflow response. So right off the bat, this area is going to get investigated further. It goes without saying, we know you have SSOs in this area, so it will be included for further investigations. Your average daily flow here is about 195,000 gallons per day with a peak daily of 300, with a peak hourly flow of 410,000 gallons per day. Your infiltration rate is about 123,000 gallons per day, and that gallons per day per inch diameter mile, about 1,800, which we've seen higher in other sewer sheds, but you definitely have a rainfall response. So as I said earlier, especially with these sub areas where we've got many other sub areas tributary to them, you tend to not see as great of a direct inflow response right away. That's because it's taking a while for all this extraneous flow to get down to that meter, but you have a huge delayed inflow. So for this one rain event, we calculated that Stony Brook alone, because these are net numbers, remember we've subtracted out the other areas, was 473,000 gallons of inflow that came in here for this event. So this one, I've been waiting for this. I wish we had done this one first. This is my favorite. Corbin Drive. It's this tiny little sewer shed that has the craziest response. So on average, you have about 22,000 gallons per day here, a peak daily flow of 123,000, a peak hourly flow of 453,000 gallons per day, an infiltration rate of almost 8,000 gallons per day, you know, a 1,000 gallons per day per inch diameter mile. But you have something connected. It's like one of those that's kind of like a little mystery that we're going to solve. You have, whether it's a catch basin or something, but when it starts raining, you have this immediate response, and the minute it stops raining, it goes away. There's
Is this
very
the sort of,
little, I'm sorry?
is this the sort of thing that would be exposed by a smoke test?
Yep, exactly something that would be exposed by a smoke test. And we did notice as we analyzed 3 events, and all 3 had this exact same response. So when it's raining, and it could be a situation where, you know, it's just drizzling, you don't notice it, but you have a low-lying catch basin. So when it rains enough, you have some ponding, and then you have this extreme reaction, but the minute it stops raining, it goes away. So this is one of those easy fixes. Once you find, hopefully, once you find it, whether it's a catch basin connection that just can be rerouted somewhere else. But this is a clear picture of II getting in when it's raining.
Yeah, the only other explanation would be that when it rains, every single person in the Corbin Drive area takes a shower at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, next one. And here's a great example of a sewer shed where you really don't have anything going on. We found one, right? Your average daily flow is about 138,000 gallons per day, peak daily flow of 180. You do have a peak every once in a while. You had a peak hourly flow of 283,000. Overall, in all 3 storms that we analyzed in this sub area, you have very little response. A majority of this sub area is low pressure sewers, so that is to be expected. I'm not surprised by this, but this is definitely an area where we would probably not recommend any other investigations. We didn't find anything here based on our metering analysis that would warrant further investigations. So all this table is, this is our infiltration results summary. And what I did was I put these in order from highest to lowest of gallons per day per inch diameter mile, that normalized threshold. So it looks like Leroy Ave Upper was your highest, followed by Mansfield Ave Lower, Mansfield Ave Upper, Mechanic Street, and Stony Brook. Interestingly enough, these were also your top 5 sub areas for your delayed inflow. So that portion of the curve where you know, it could be from rainfall induced infiltration. So it was interesting to see that they jive together, not necessarily the same as the direct inflow numbers, but the same as the delayed inflow numbers. So this graph here is our inflow result summary, and this is a little bit different. What's highlighted in yellow here is that column is percent of total inflow for the rain event. So the way we look at what's the worst sub area in terms of inflow is we pick a storm event and we say what sub areas contributed 80% of the total inflow. So the ones highlighted in yellow, those are the ones that for this rain event: Mansfield Ave Upper, Stony Brook, Leroy Ave Upper, Mechanic Street, and Mansfield Ave Lower. So, and the reason why the Corbin Drive has an X next to it is because even though it didn't contribute the highest percentage of anything, for direct inflow, it was one of your highest because of whatever's going on in that sub area, that catch basin or people in the shower. So the X signifies where we intend to do further SSES investigations.
Before we move on to next steps, does anybody have any questions? All right. So after all of that data and all of our number crunching and all of the analysis, the next step is to develop the flow metering report. And this will include the prioritization of the sub areas and recommendations for follow-on investigations. And as I mentioned before, like, we're utilizing the flow metering results as a tool to really hone in and tailor those follow-on investigations, depending upon if an area has high infiltration, high inflow, or both. Those investigations will be tailored accordingly. So with high infiltration, we're going to be doing flow isolation, CCTV, and manhole inspections. And with high inflow areas, it can include smoke testing, dye testing, and manhole inspections as well. So as part of the Clean Water Fund grant, DEEP requires review of this report before approving the entire funding for follow-on investigations. So while the review of the report can take up to 90 days, DEEP had previously approved of the request.
Uh-oh, did Lindsay freeze for everyone else, or is that just me?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, Lindsay, you want to go back about a minute and repeat?
Just lost your audio, Lindsay.
I can pick up if we lost.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I think what Lindsay was just about to dive into is that DEEP did approve a portion, about 25% of our budget for SSES activities, which would be that flow isolation that Amy described, manhole inspections, and CCTV. So we've used our allocation approved already by DEEP for the flow isolation work that we did in Brookside and Mechanic. But we do have some money for CCTV and manhole inspections, which we will hope to use as soon as possible. We want to kind of keep rolling now that we have some good momentum. So we'll take advantage of what's approved now based on monitoring the groundwater levels to make sure that they're high enough for us to do so. And then hope to get DEEP's approval to unlock the remainder of the SSES money as soon as possible so that we can really go full steam probably into spring.
If let's just make the assumption they approve your flow metering report and they agree with your findings and your areas of focus, do we have money in what we imagined was the overall budget to do all the work you think is necessary in those sub-watersheds in terms of investigation?
Amy, do you have a good sense of that yet based on how much you've seen in the data review, or is that, I know when we did our original budget, I think we were targeting Stony Brook and Mechanic, right? So we've probably peeled back layers on some others and maybe seen areas of Stony Brook that we don't need to focus on as intently maybe as we thought before. But wondering if you can shed more light on that question.
So are you asking, I just want to make sure I understand, are you asking based on what our original scope is, do you think that those are enough quantities to investigate everything that we've found so far?
Yes.
Okay. I can't say for certain, but I will say that we prioritize everything. So we're going to go through and look very detailed at what we've come up with. So there's always work to do, right? So we're just going to look and see what are your highest priorities, what's your biggest bang for your buck, and just take it from there. But we do have a decent amount of quantities in the contract, so I'm not worried about it based on what we've found.
So in the ballpark, we'll get a good distance into this analysis.
I do think so, yes.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but are those pictures on the right our system?
I think the only one is the one of the manhole cover.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I didn't find pouring antifreeze in one of our pipes. I would have thought we would have heard about that.
That's dye testing.
Oh, those dye testing. Okay.
Yep.
I got a little worried for a second there.
That's a preview of things to come.
Yeah.
And sorry, Craig, yeah, we may very well find this stuff. There aren't many systems where we don't find such things, the green and the cracks.
Okay, yeah, the catch basin is the smoke test. We want to find that, right? If we find that, like you said, that's the easy fix.
Typically, smoking gun, as the
Yeah.
name implies. Yep.
All right, that's it.
That was a great question. Thank you. So I think that brings us to the second, the last two bullets here on the next steps, which would be a summary to the commission and to the town of the findings of the SSES work that we do. And really the jewel of that report is going to be recommendations, right? So based on those SSES activities, where you need to focus, where we're recommending lining, manhole repairs, what have you, to address the issues that you have, and to make sure that everything is eligible for deep funding all the way through. We'll include an analysis that's basically a cost benefit of what it costs to treat that extra water versus the cost for the projects to remove that extraneous flow and deal with it. And the CMOM development will be ongoing, as we discussed. And even though I think Lindsay is still sharing somehow, but I think that was the last slide anyway, and we were going to open it up for discussion. So any
other question I had was, where do you just benchmark? Where do you think we are on schedule of delivery for the recommendations report and the CMOM? And this is no pressure. We have time. I'm just curious to have that in my head as we're dealing with Save the Sound.
I think that the SSC CMOM will probably come first because we're kind of well into the process there. We had workshops, 3 different workshops with the town staff to go through the entire EPA checklist in the guidance document for the areas of improvement and CMOM kind of protocols and practices. So I think the next steps for CMOM are really to just develop an action plan and kind of pull that document together based on all the information that we have. That is going to be a living and breathing document that can change, things like hotspots and can continually be updated. But I would say within the next 6 months, we should have a really solid version of that CMOM program document. And Lindsay's not here, so she can't argue with me because she's kind of spearheading that. So when she's back, we'll confirm that timing with her, but that would be my best guess right now. And then the SSES, Amy, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we would need to have all of those investigations complete before writing that report. Obviously, we'll be keeping you all updated on what we find as we find it through Ed. But I think the official report document that would then go to DEEP as a second deliverable to review, I think we're thinking the big push on SSES is going to be spring 2021, just based on unlocking that funding and favorable groundwater conditions. So that report would follow the completion of the SSES activity.
So maybe approximately 12 months from now.
That would be my guess.
Okay, great. That's just the big picture I was looking for. I guess we'll open it up for questions. Kate or Ed, do you guys want to have any questions before I go to the commissioners? Kate looks good. Ed staying on mute. Oh, here he comes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, and Vanessa, just kind of clarify for me now. When you say big picture year from now, does that recommendations include the capital improvements? Is that what we're talking about?
That would include recommendations for capital improvements and a schedule to prioritize those.
And what about our pump station investigations? I know we had to put that on hold because of the pandemic that we were going through or are going through now. But any ideas maybe getting back into that? I'd like to think that we could check that box off too. Something that I can start to build into a capital program over the next couple of years. So right now, I'm just trying to put something together to give you some, 30,000 feet look at our capital budget for the next couple of years.
Yep, I can talk with you offline and we can get that scheduled. I think even at this point, we can do that work as soon as the town is ready to have us out. Because we can, socially distance and have our masks on and do that work safely. So we can certainly do those inspections sooner and have that as a separate memo that would get tied into the SSES findings when that entire report is ready, but there would be no reason that we can't proceed with that work and give you our findings related to the pump stations much sooner than that. I think that could be on.
Seems like a good use of time while we're waiting for DEP and while we're waiting for the spring.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. Let's all welcome Lindsay back. Hi, Lindsay.
But now she's on mute.
It'd help if I unmute it. A lot of technical difficulties here. I apologize that the internet completely crashed here.
Ed, are you good?
No, no problem at all. No, listen, that's a great report. I'd like to see that at least one of our sub areas was a good report. So that was nice, and great to see that some of these things were, with the rain, glaringly obvious that there's a priority needed to go after certain sub areas or watershed areas, sewershed areas. But thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Bob, do you have any questions?
No, I'm good. I'll just second the fact that Ed said that it seemed to be there was a number of concentrated places, which for us are good because it means less rehab with better results.
Yeah. Susan, you just ran away, but wanted to ask if you had any questions. You're good. Okay. Let's see. Do either of the gentlemen sitting at Town Hall with Darren have any questions? You're muted, Darren, so I can't hear anything.
Try it now. How about now?
Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
All right. The question I would have is your modeling sounds great, and the sub-sewer sheds as they pertains to events where we know they're surging, is there any way that you could level the model such that it could predict anything that we could help in sewer shed A as it pertains to where it's surcharging downstream? Kind of like a time of concentration of an event that would cause a surcharge and how we might cure that upstream in the other sewer sheds. Bang for the buck as it pertains to surcharges. Makes sense.
Craig, for the record, that speakers should identify themselves.
That was Reese Hutchinson.
This is Reese Hutchinson. Thanks, Kate.
If you look at the camera.
You want me to go over there?
You could wait. No, you can just wait if you want.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, we got photo ID now.
Yeah, I zoomed over to Darren.
So I just want to make sure I understand what you're asking specifically. We did not do a hydraulic model here. I just did some desktop analysis, and Arcadis does use a software called TSA to do some inflow analysis. But I guess I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're asking so I can answer it. I don't.
It would be more or less how all the sub-analysis of the different watersheds could be joined together in terms of analyzing the effects on certain things the town might do to avoid surcharging at a certain point. Time of concentration, exactly what you're talking about, a hydraulic model, how it relates to where there might be a manhole that's surcharging.
It's somewhat related to, Amy talked about this a little bit when she was talking about subtracting upstream sewer sheds, Reese.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. In time of concentration, another word here is attenuation. It takes a while for some of that inflow to get from a higher sub area down to the lower, closer to Stony Brook. We don't really look at them necessarily in that regard holistically. However, we see where the highest individual infiltration or inflow rates are, and we target those areas. So as a result, we are in fact affecting everything downstream of an area when we do work in an upstream area.
Right. Yep. Thank you.
So, you're welcome.
Any other questions from commissioners? All right, hearing none, I just want to say this was fabulous work. It's a lot of data, and you did a great job synthesizing it and presenting it in a very clear and concise fashion. I remain excited for the next steps to really identify specifically what the problems are, with the hope of finding very actionable, correctable situations. Hopefully it's not a bunch of sump pumps that are going to take us decades to go after.
Thank you. It's been a privilege for us to work with the town, and we're excited as well to see this through and solve the mysteries, as Amy would say.
Actually,
Not all sump pumps.
that actually created a question. Looking at the data, is there any way to ascertain the portion that might be related to things within our control? Things on the mains, the manholes, the laterals, and town cross connections versus things a little more difficultly outside of our control, like private sump pump connections and so forth.
That's really hard to tell looking at the graphs the way that they are now. But you do start to get a feel when you get out there and you're in the individual sub areas and you start doing investigations. You sort of get a feel for, entire neighborhoods might all be the same. So if you see clear flow coming after it rained and you notice people seem to have sump pump connections, you might say, okay, well, in this neighborhood we've narrowed it down to that. Or you go to another neighborhood and you see that all the pipes are cracked and broken, and so that isn't sump pumps, that's lining that needs to be done. So we sort of just try to chip away at it when we go through and use all the tools to try to figure it out. But it is really difficult, almost impossible, to look at a hydrograph and say, I know that's, especially be one thing if we were looking at like a neighborhood, you might be able to, some of the real gurus might be able to say, oh, I've seen this before. But when you're looking at 40,000 linear feet together, you can't break it down that way.
Okay.
And when we get deep into the CCTV in particular, we'll see, is it cracks like at that picture that you're looking at right now, or is it a constantly running service connection from a house that's running too long to be a washing machine or a shower or a dishwasher, and it's crystal clear flow? Then it's a sump pump, and we hope we find more of the former that you are in control of than the latter.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, excellent job. We look forward to continuing working with you guys and getting more information. I'm sure Ed and Darren will keep us in the loop. Ed or Darren, before we close out, do you guys have anything you need to add?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Darren, I can't hear you.
I would just like to ask, I'm sorry, since we have the commissioners all together, what do you guys want to do Tuesday? You want to meet remotely? Turn that down. Turn that line. Sorry.
That's right. I can hear you now.
Can we all meet remotely?
Yeah, I'm.
You guys have access to computers? Because it seems to be a problem getting a room here.
Yeah,
so, I sent that email earlier.
I think remote is good if everybody's willing to do it.
That work for all the commissioners.
Works for me.
I can't hear him.
Yeah, it works for me. I just got to remember
Works for me.
to charge my iPad.
Works for me.
Everybody's good?
Yep, everybody's good.
Okay, Peter and Reese? Yeah. Peter and Reese both say yes. I don't know if you can hear them. So,
All right, I'll book
thanks.
the link
Let's all
and send
plan
it
on
out.
meeting remotely.
I'll book the link tomorrow, Darren, and I'll send it to you for the agenda.
Sorry for the screw up today. I'm the guy who put it on the agenda that said we would meet only commissioners physically.
We still love you.
Okay, I'm done.
All right,
Thank you.
End the meeting. Thank you very much. Be well, be safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Craig.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.